Next myth. The Australian Taxation Office, the ATO, has acted impartially towards AMI. The truth, the total opposite. The ATO has, without doubt, acted unjustly towards AMI. Prior to revoking a charitable status, the ATO was required to undertake a comprehensive review. Instead, less than a week after SAPOL's raid, the ATO arrogantly revoked AMI's charitable status. An unprecedented 9 separate cases against AMI are now in progress. The ATO ignored the indisputable, the arguable fact that AMI is a religious institution. The ATO tried to justify its actions by quoting unsubstantiated media reports and Martin Penny's fraudulent affidavit as key reasons for the revocation. Hardly a comprehensive review. In so doing, and with the help of SAPOL, the ATO has brought a sense of credibility to the baseless media reports and civil claims, which otherwise would have been dismissed as being ridiculous and unfounded. Showing complete disregard for due process, the ATO issued garnishee orders for after-tax dollars and funds held on trust for parishioners. It successfully applied to the court to freeze all of AMI's assets, along with assets of anyone else their unreliable witness suggested. No provision was made for living and legal expenses for any of the AMI-related people being hounded by them. Pastor Leo and ministers of his church have been stranded in a foreign country with no access to money since mid-2010. The ATO has forced them to live like shipwrecked castaways. Over this 4-year tribulation, bereft of money, shelter, food and justice, these innocents each lost 15 to 20 kilos. They continually deal with the dangers of a homeless life. Some nights these Christian ministers were even on the street, sleeping under trees, their only avenue for food being coconuts left scattered on the road. As guiltless people, these experiences have changed them forever. The ATO has ignored this enormous pile of evidence supporting them, refusing to even consider that they may be innocent. Despite this clear discrimination against law-abiding Australian citizens, the ATO is unrelenting in their pursuit and careless of the consequences, perhaps hoping that one day they will surrender to the torment. It begs the question, why is the ATO acting so maliciously towards Australians? Doesn't the ATO's own slogan state that they are supposed to be working for all Australians? Would you be surprised if I told you that the ATO was not actually a government authority? Or if the agency to which it reports was not even Australian? Or if the ATO itself was not even considered a legal entity? Well, guess what? Proof exists that these statements are actually facts. Recently, several cases have been brought before the High Court of Australia challenging the ATO's legitimacy, and the ATO has not been able to provide any documentation that proves it is either a legal entity or that it is established following correct procedure. This dilemma stems from when the Australian Tax Office illegally replaced the Department of Taxation in 1973. Under legislation, a government department can only be established by the Governor-General of the Commonwealth of Australia, coupled with the use of the Great Seal of the United Kingdom. This procedure was not followed, thereby making the ATO an illegal entity. Also, as per legislation, the government is obliged to publish any changes made to bureaucratic systems through the Government Gazette. However, it has been proven in the High Court that this never occurred. The Commissioner of Taxation has even produced sworn affidavits confirming that the government failed to gazette this non-entity, therefore confirming that the ATO is not a legal entity. Why did the government fail to establish the ATO in accordance with legislation? Is it because the whole operation and structure of the ATO is so unjust that it never would have been able to pass through the required constitutional procedures, which have to be approved by the Australian people? Just one example of this unjust operation is that senior staff are earning bonuses paid on a sliding scale, or a percentage of assessments levied against Australian citizens, regardless of accuracy. How can a public servant be serving the public when they are motivated by collecting bonuses based on the amount of assessments they can levy? Another example shows a massive conflict of interest. The ATO subjectively decides what the assessment or the debt value is, including outrageous penalties. It even controls the assessment objections and appeals process. In AMI's case, email trails reveal that the ATO staff reviewing the objections was collaborating with the very same audit team that issued the initial assessments. The ATO manager of the charitable revocation was the same person to whom the objection reviewer reported. The ATO is also the debt collection agency. How can this process be objective? And if that's not enough, it ties taxpayers' hand with its pay now, fight later strategy to bankrupt them, thereby avoiding a court challenge. This structure is morally wrong and illegal. It helps to explain why tax officers' behaviour can be so bestial, each year foreclosing and liquidating businesses by the tens of thousands just so they can enjoy their juicy bonuses. Despite these facts, the High Court has so far avoided ruling against the ATO's legality. Instead, judges have excluded and ignored evidence concerning these truths and have instead concurred with tax officers by saying that even though the ATO is not a legal entity, it is in fact directly linked to the federal government, meaning it does not have a separate identity to the Commonwealth of Australia, thereby making its tax assessments valid. This leads to the question, what exactly is the present-day form of the federal government? And how does it compare with the Commonwealth of Australia as described in the Australian Constitution of 1901? Would you be surprised to find a company with the same name as your country registered with the Security and Exchange Commission in Washington, D.C.? Well, guess what? After a bit of investigation, it turns out that the Commonwealth of Australia somehow happens to be a corporation listed in the United States. It is simultaneously the government of Australia and a US-based company. Well, that certainly raises some questions. What possible reason could there be for registering a country as a company, and even worse, registering it in another country? By definition, aren't corporate and government entities mutually exclusive? And doesn't government regulate companies? A perusal of the American Security and Exchange website reveals that when the Commonwealth of Australia Corporation has to present its annual financials to the Commission as per the Security and Exchange Commission regulation, it provides the official annual prospectus of Australia, as produced by the Australian Treasurer. This confirms the corporation's identity is one and the same as the Australian government. It is also important to note that the Commonwealth of Australia Corporation also owns a trademarked logo through the United States Trademark Registry. This registered and owned logo somehow happens to be the Great Seal of Australia, thereby reconfirming this corporation's link to our government. Given these facts, it appears as though the Australian government is a corporate entity whose primary purpose is to make a profit for overseas shareholders rather than being true representatives for the people of Australia. It is not the legitimate government of Australia as described by the Constitution of Australia in 1901. So how did the Australian people come to be governed by a corporation And how did the Great Seal of Australia be owned by a business? Well, it appears as though the Parliament of modern Australia has to be able to fraudulently approve and implement changes to the Constitution without holding referendums. These actions have directly allowed a US corporation to infiltrate government and allowed them to rule our nation in line with their own shareholder-guided and profit-driven principles, whilst our Constitution is regulated to the trash can. However, in the face of this evidence, Australian judges and bankers behave as if the ATO and the government are valid and refuse to stand up for the people of Australia. What motivation do they have to ignore the truth? Well, judges are hesitant to indict the tax office because if they rule against the ATO, then they are in effect calling into question the whole validity of the so-called Australian government. If a judge rules against the ATO in favour of an average Australian taxpayer, it is the same as saying the entire system is invalid, meaning it would also likely cost judges their jobs, as the current judicial system would be branded invalid. To date, not one judge in Australia has been brave enough to acknowledge the truth. Instead, they stick with what was suggested by former High Court Judge Sir Harry Gibbs, in that he recommended that judges refuse to rule on anything to do with the Constitution because, in his opinion, it is a political matter, not a judicial issue. Judges uphold the law rather than make the law. Banks readily comply with siphoning of funds via ATO garnishee orders because it turns out that, like the government and the ATO, the banks are also controlled by overseas corporations. A perusal of the largest shareholders of the Big Four banks reveals the majority stakeholdings are being held by elite US corporations, whose shareholders also seemingly form the private ownership of the ATO. Despite the historical decisions made by the courts, Agape Ministries International is continuing to challenge the ATO and the corrupt government on behalf of all Australians, asking for this so-called government agency to prove its legitimacy under Australian law and demanding that it cease robbing and deceiving the sovereign people of Australia. This growing truth movement within Australia has already resulted in the resignation of 2 ATO commissioners. AMI awaits a formal reply from the ATO in regard to evidence and facts provided to the ATO's legitimacy. All Australians shall shortly be made aware of the truth and justice shall prevail. The Australian people will be set free.